Thank you everyone for coming to our talk. My name is Celeste Paul and I'm here with my colleague Josiah Dijkstra, and we're here to talk about some work that we've done at the National Security Agency on stress and hacking. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a senior researcher and technical advisor at NSA Research. My background's in human-centered computing, which is focused on computer science, psychology, and design. And my background tends to be more on the psychology and computer science end of things. And the reason why I'm so interested in working in cybersecurity specifically is that we traditionally focus so much on technology in cyber, but not as much on the people, and I happen to be a people person.
Good morning, I'm Josiah Dijkstra. I am the Deputy Technical Director for NSA's Cybersecurity Operations Organization. My PhD is in computer science, and I've spent the bulk of my career looking at technology and trying to make that more safe and secure. I have a great love for cybersecurity science, and I like to inject that into all the projects that I do. And I learned a couple of years ago that I had been neglecting this really interesting area, which is how humans interact and intersect with technology. And I've spent a lot of recent time delving into that and those kind of subjects. So the agenda for today is this on the screen. I'm going to give you a little bit about the NSA just to set the context for the work that we did so you can understand where we're coming from. I will tell you what we mean when we say tactical cyber operations and what that phrase means to us. And Celeste will come and talk about stress and hacking, a survey that we developed and a case study we did at the NSA. And I'll come back towards the end to talk about how you can put these results to work in whatever job or environment that you operate in. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. So for anybody that may be unfamiliar, the National Security Agency is an intelligence organization and a support element to the US Department of Defense. And NSA has two missions given to us through two authorities. The first mission is foreign signals intelligence. This is our mandate to collect and process and disseminate intelligence information to US decision makers and military planners and operators. Our second authority is cybersecurity, and NSA used to call this information assurance. So cybersecurity is our other mission to protect national security systems. National security systems is anything that handles classified information or is critical to the conduct of intelligence operations or military operations. So there are a lot of threats in cyber. The top ones for NSA and for the government today are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And all of these have conducted attacks against the United States in recent years. Russia, for example, we've seen a lot of influence campaigns over a lot of years that have really ramped up and has become very, very aggressive more recently. In China, there's been a lot of both public and private reporting that shows what used to be large-scale, massive, very loud attacks have pulled back a little bit. They're a bit more tailored than they used to be. But still a very important nation for the United States. In Iran, we've seen a change from disruptive and sort of loud attacks that are sort of now more in line with their geopolitical norms. And in North Korea, it's very clear to us that every military conflict has a cyber component that goes right along with it. And so these are the requirements that NSA gets handed to us from the National Intelligence Organization. So cyber is something we don't do alone. We have a lot of partners in this work, and we collaborate with them on a nearly daily basis. So I said that NSA was a member of the intelligence community, and we do cyber work with all of those other members on a daily basis as well. We have a close partnership with the military, the combatant commands, especially US Cyber Command, because US Cyber Command is the group charged with doing military operations in cyberspace. We have a lot of foreign partners, and I think many people are familiar with our Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. This is our close partnership with Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and we do cyber with all of them. Among our law enforcement partners would be the FBI. And the FBI has domestic responsibility for cyber attacks and espionage and those kinds of disruptive cyber activities. We have a lot of US government partners. One, for example, is the Department of Energy. So the DOE is responsible for domestic energy sectors and foreign threats targeting that sector. And NSA has lots of partnerships and research collaborations with academia. I've done lots of these in my own research career. One I'm still involved in is looking at how humans make risk decisions when they're online. And the goal there is to help at-risk users be more secure on the internet. So this partnership comes together at the National Cybersecurity Threat Operations Center, NCTOC. This is a 24/7 operations center where NSA works with our partners to do cybersecurity mission together. Last month, we started moving into the Integrated Cyber Center, and the picture you see on the screen is actually one of the first photos we've shown of that space. So you can see it's a pretty large environment and lets us do this job together with our partners to ensure that the nation is secure and safe. So cyber is a broad brush, right? And there's many different kinds of operations. NSA does, for example, computer network exploitation using our SIGINT authorities. We also do a variety of defensive operations. For example, our blue team is responsible for working with DoD network operators and owners to make sure we find the vulnerabilities and secure them before it's too late. Authorized hacking here refers to our red team. And our red team emulates adversaries that we know about, and again tries to protect DoD networks by pretending to be those adversaries and fixing the vulnerabilities before anyone else can take advantage of them. And the third one here is our hunt mission. And in hunt, we use our intelligence to proactively look for adversaries on our own networks and try and root them out to, again, secure DoD systems. The common thread across all of those things I just described is that they are very tactical in nature. And so when we say tactical cyber operations, this is what I'm referring to. This is hands-on keyboard kind of work. And in your own lives, it would be analogous to capture the flag or red team penetration testing. And so an operation is a planned, sort of structured activity with a specific goal in mind. So in our presentation, that's what we're talking about. Now, performance in this kind of work is really closely tied to speed and precision. And so we need a very highly trained workforce to do this kind of work. But the work is also high risk, right? Risk comes with the mission, and failure has very real, tangible consequences. So those pressures are strong, right? And stress can really be harmful on the humans doing this kind of work. And it can lead to things like turnover and retention that I think we would all agree are really important topics in cyber. It takes a lot of time and energy and talent to train and retain that workforce, and so we want to keep them as much as we can.
Okay, thank you, Josiah. So just to pause here, I'm really excited to be here this year at Black Hat because there is a great human factors and community track that is covering stress in a lot of different ways. So before our talk, you heard about addiction in information security. We're talking about cognitive stress in actual operation, so hacking. And then this afternoon, you'll hear more about burnout, depression, and suicide in the hacking community. And then tomorrow, you'll hear more about PTSD. And what this shows is, I think anyone who's worked in cybersecurity for any period of time has known that these issues have existed, but we're starting to recognize them so that we can focus on the health and safety of our workforce. So let's get right into talking about stress. Stress is an adverse reaction to events or incidents in the world. Everyone experiences it differently, and no two events are necessarily the same. There are a couple of different types of stress or degrees of stress that we were concerned with. The first one is acute stress, and this is the normal everyday stress of these events that are either unpredictable or just a little bit out of your control. And this is what triggers your fight or flight response. So your heart rate goes up, your palms get sweaty, but as soon as that stressor goes away, you go back to normal, you relax, and everything is okay. And some people do well under stress. They enjoy the excitement of working in a challenging environment. They enjoy the clarity or focus that the stress, the additional adrenaline gives them. And in itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing. When stress becomes a problem is whenever it becomes repetitive, and you experience it so often that your body, both physically and mentally, you don't have enough time to recover in between these stressful events. And so you're kind of operating at this high buzz from event to event without getting a chance to relax and collect yourself again. And if you have underlying conditions, health conditions, they can start to be aggravated by this, even though the stress might be manageable and uncomfortable. However, if you're enduring this stress over a long period of time, what we call chronic stress, this can start to have a lot of effects on your health, even if you're a healthy person. And what we mean by chronic stress, there are a lot of different ways that this could be characterized. This could be anything from growing up in a war zone or being stuck in an unhappy marriage and not knowing how to get out. It could be in a dead-end job, or being in a job that you have to have because you need the money, but you don't necessarily enjoy it, or you have an abusive work relationship. And something that's really key to chronic stress is this lack of control, or no sense of control over the environment around you. So no matter how much you try to exert your will on the things around you, things just don't seem to work out. So stress exists in a lot of different areas. This is air traffic control, which for human factors people, this is a classic domain of study. And air traffic control has a different kind of stress. So this is a high demand, high attention, requires lots of working memory and visual perception in order to get the job done. You may be surprised how much air traffic control is still manual, but there are people up in those towers, and they are constantly watching the screens in order to make sure that airplanes don't run into each other, basically. And this is very stressful because they have a vigilance condition, so they have to watch for abnormal events that don't occur very often. So this is the cognitive work or cognitive stress aspect of the job. But then they also have the emotional responsibility, the emotional stress because of the responsibility of lots of people's lives and safety. So another domain is in emergency responders, and this is a little bit different from air traffic control. This is not necessarily that long-term vigilance that air traffic controllers get their stress from, but rather these tend to be episodic in a way that have stressors that have a high emotional and physical toll on the emergency responders involved. And this is important to note because they often need to make snap judgments with incomplete information. And whenever you're stressed out, that does affect decision making, and you don't want that to affect emergency responders whenever they're doing their jobs. Getting closer into the technology range, we have cyber warfare. And there are a lot of different things that affect cyber warfare from a stress perspective, and I'll go into that in detail in a couple of minutes. But something that is unique to this kind of work is the shift work, or the length of shift, in addition to working in a complex and unpredictable environment. And those types of things are contributing to stress in a different way than the emergency responders or the air traffic controllers. So what is it about hacking that makes it so stressful? Some of you may have your own opinions on this. Hopefully they match with mine. Or you've experienced this yourself and you can resonate with what it is that we are working on here. So cyber is hard, right? I mean, we get our new boxes full of analytics and they give us fancy new tools, but somehow the job gets harder and harder every year. It's because it's complex, right? It is a very unpredictable environment where a lot of things can go wrong, and even if you try to control all of your independent variables, you can't. There are just too many things, too many moving parts. And especially in our mission, we are in a high-risk, high-reward environment that just ups the stakes of all of these mistakes that could potentially happen whenever things don't go right. So getting back to stress, Stress is actually kind of hard to study in some ways because it's so subjective and individuals experience it in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of things that contribute to stress, and so you can't just study one factor versus another factor. You have to look at it as a system. It's also very dependent on the environment, and so it makes it hard to transfer things that you know from one domain, like air traffic control, into another domain, like cyber warfare. And since it's so subjective, we need to use subjective measures in order to really capture what's going on. That's not necessarily the only way that you can study stress. You can study stress objectively and measure effects on the body. However, in our environment, that's not necessarily the best method for us to use. We don't want to use a study methodology that might induce stress when we're trying to study stress. There were three things in particular that we were concerned that stress was affecting with our tactical operators. The first one was fatigue, and this is just the physical or mental feeling of tiredness. The second one was frustration, and this is anxiety and annoyance over lack of control. And if you remember my definition of stress, control really contributed to the episodic and chronic conditions. And then the last thing was cognitive workload, which is the amount of mental effort needed to use working memory. And I'll break out cognitive workload a little bit more because that in itself is a little bit complex. So the first factor is fatigue. To study fatigue, we used something called the Samparelli Fatigue Scale. It was originally developed by the Air Force Research Lab to study fatigue in fighter pilots, and has since been transitioned and used in a lot of different domains, including information technology. And here we're just measuring it on a 20-point scale, and we actually anchor it in a couple of different ways, just so that people had a sense of what the scale was like. The next one was the NASA TLX, or the NASA Task Load Index, and this was developed by NASA in order to study cognitive workload in space systems. And this could be used both for physical interfaces, such as spacecraft, or virtual interfaces, such as computer user interfaces. And this is where cognitive work and frustration start to get a little bit complex, because there are a lot of things that contribute to it. So the first factor is mental demand, which is just measuring how mentally demanding the operation was. There's also a physical demand aspect to it. This is more important for physical systems like spacecraft rather than user interfaces, but some operations take longer than others, and so that length of time that you're doing things, sitting in a chair, sitting in front of a keyboard, might have some type of effect. The next one is time demand, which is basically time pressure. How pressured, hurried, or rushed did you feel in order to complete the task? And then there's also a measure of overall performance. This is a self-assessment of how well you think you did, not necessarily what the outcome of the actual operation was. Frustration is part of the model, and this is how insecure, discouraged, irritated, stressed, and annoyed you are, so it's a little bit recursive of a definition there. And then finally, we have effort, which is how hard did you work in order to accomplish your level of performance. So as I mentioned before, stress is very individual, and there are a couple of factors that we were more concerned with just because they were more volatile to those individual differences. One of them was fatigue, and we were concerned about measuring the actual effect of the operation on fatigue, not necessarily the overall fatigue level of our operators, although we did want to capture that as well. And so the way to work out those numbers is we baselined it, where we measured fatigue before the operation and then again after the operation. So we had a sense of how tired operators were coming into the operation, how tired they were at the end of the operation overall, but then also the difference between the two, so the delta, how much fatigue actually increased over the course of the operation. The other factor that we were concerned with normalizing was frustration, and this is actually one that we didn't anticipate, and it came out of pilot studies. where people were bringing a lot of frustration into the operation itself, and we wanted to separate that out from the frustration of the operation. And so we did the same thing that we did with fatigue, where we asked people how frustrated they were at the beginning of the operation, how frustrated they were at the end of the operation. So this all comes together in what we developed as the Cyber Operations Stress Survey. There are some additional questions there just for background or contextual questions to capture information about the operation itself. But basically, you have a short questionnaire at the very beginning of the operation and very end of the operation in order to capture this experience. So we made that survey very short on purpose. We were working in a mission environment, and we didn't want to affect the mission simply by studying our operators. We could have potentially pulled our operators out of mission, ran them through a training scenario, and measured their stress. And that's really what we do in academia. It's also very clinical. And what we really wanted was something with ecological validity so that we could actually speak to operations in mission. So let's get to the NSA part. So we took the COSS, the Cyber Operations Stress Survey, and we used it at 4 different NSA locations. So we used it at headquarters in Washington and 3 of our cryptologic centers. This includes Georgia, Texas, and Hawaii. There were 126 operators who participated in the survey and 361 surveys that we collected. So this was about 2.5 surveys per operator, give or, plus or minus. We also collected surveys from both the civilian and military population. However, the military participants were assigned to NSA. These were not US Cyber Command operators. So it should come as no surprise that tactical cyber operations cause stress. I would have been shocked if we didn't find this. So let's look at some of these numbers. So fatigue on our 20-point scale at the beginning of the operation started at about 6 points. And it ended at about 9.5 points with an increase of 16%. With frustration, we started around the same place, around 6.5 points, ended around 9 points for an overall difference in 12%. And these differences are statistically significant. So let's look into cognitive workload. So we have mental demand, which was relatively about in the middle of the road. Physical demand was somewhere near the bottom. We were actually a little surprised that physical demand was as high as it was, but thinking about how long operators were sitting at the keyboard and thinking about the vigilance aspect of some of the work that they do, it started to make a little bit more sense. Time pressure was somewhere on the bottom end of the scale. Self-assessments of performance were near the top. Effort was near the middle of the scale, and I already talked about frustration. I like to look at these numbers individually because they provide more context. However, you can munge together the TLX into a cumulative score, which is often done whenever you want to transfer your results and compare them to another study. There aren't that many studies that in cybersecurity that use the TLX as a measure of cognitive workload, but for the few that we did find, our raw TLX value is somewhat comparable. So I just showed you a bunch of numbers, and I know you're thinking, was that a lot? That's a very good question. And I sometimes think about that as well, but I think there's a better question of so what or why. And let's get into that a little bit more. So let's break out cognitive workload. And so what I've done here is I've taken that model, those 6 factors, and I'm just looking for correlating values. Are there relationships between these factors, and what are those relationships? Are they positive or are they negative? And since this is a well-validated model, you would expect that these factors would be related or linked in some way. And for the most part, that's true. So we see that mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, effort, and frustration are all positively correlated, meaning that as they go up or down, there's a relationship for those other factors to also go up or down. However, something weird is going on with performance. Performance is the one factor that isn't linked to these other factors, meaning no matter how much mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, or effort may go up or down, there's no relationship to the self-assessment of performance. So there doesn't seem to be a link or relationship. Where we do see a link or relationship is with frustration, meaning as frustration goes up, self-assessments of performance go down. And I find this interesting because frustration was one of those factors that was linked to mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, and effort. So it fits within that model, but then breaks out again in performance. So clearly there's some type of interaction or effect going on here. So now let's look at changes in fatigue and frustration. So we've basically taken that normalized value. It's much more sensitive. We have a little less data to work with, but it's more descriptive and accurate of what's actually going on. And so here again, we can see that mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, effort, and frustration are all linked to changes in fatigue and changes in frustration. Meaning is, as those things go up or down, or increase or decrease, so do the other factors. So they're linked together pretty well. But again, we see that performance is doing weird things, at least in the case of changes in fatigue. So for an operation that may be more or less tiring than other operations, performance isn't affected. There is no relationship with that factor. But we're still seeing something going on with frustration. And again, frustration is part of that cognitive workload model, that cognitive stress model. And this is a more sensitive measure than the one that we were looking at in the previous screens. Again, no matter how, so the only thing that's really affecting how well people think that they're doing in their operation is how frustrated they are over the course of the operation. So something else that I want to talk about is op length and the role of time in all of this. And just for context, the average operation of the ones that we surveyed was about 5 hours, plus or minus. And so when we look at the same thing, when we look at op length, we again see that there are relationships between mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, effort, and frustration, but not performance. Meaning that there was no relationship between the length of the operation and how well people felt that they did. So let's look at changes in fatigue and frustration then. So we see here that there is a relationship between fatigue and frustration. As the operation length increases, fatigue increases. This is intuitive. If we didn't find this, we would probably question it. However, we also see that op length is also affecting cumulative frustration in some way. So the longer ops tend to be more frustrating. So now we're starting to pull apart some of the pieces where we didn't see a relationship between performance and op length, but we are seeing a relationship between cumulative frustration and op length, and we know that there's a relationship between frustration and performance. Something else that I want to talk about is that 5-hour mark. So it's just by accident that our average op length also was a critical value for differences that we saw. So don't read too much into that part. But what we found was that operations that were less than 5 hours compared to operations that were greater than 5 hours, there was a difference of about 10% in the change in fatigue and change in frustration overall. Okay. So what do we think is going on? Well, remember who our operators are. They're highly skilled, highly trained, very dedicated to the mission, and they're very results driven. I mean, they're just like you, right? They have pride in their work. They always want to win. And I think the extra something special is that they're at NSA because they believe in the mission and they believe in the work that we do. And I think this is what's feeding into this weird relationship between performance and frustration. They put the success of the mission above all else, even themselves. They're taking on this mental demand, physical demand, time pressure, and effort. And, you know, that's just part of the environment, but the frustration is something that they can't take on and deal with on their own. A lot is riding on their success, and they can absorb all of those other factors. They can maybe work a little bit harder. They can maybe pull themselves together and focus. They can go grab a coffee. They can go take a walk around the block. But the frustration that can't leave them through that walk around the block or just getting up from the desk or taking that deep breath is starting to point towards those chronic and episodic stress conditions. And that's why we're very concerned about this. So remember, cyber is complex and unpredictable, and that it seems to be what's feeding into this, and it's not something that we can necessarily control. We're not trying to take stress away from tactical cyber operations. Cyber is hard. There will be stress. Stress is not necessarily bad when it's manageable. However, when it becomes unmanageable, when you take away the control that someone needs in order to be able to manage it or feel like that they have control over themselves or their lives, that's where we start to see the negative effects. So in psychology, we have this concept called locus of control, which is the extent to which a person feels that they have control over the outcome of events in their lives. And I believe this is really at the core of where we see a lot of our stress in not just our tactical cyber operations, but in a lot of other cybersecurity operations in industry. And it's, I think, emphasized, or it's harder in our environment because it's not just about losing money, losing a customer, maybe losing reputation on Twitter or whatever it is. Again, NSA is part of the Department of Defense, and we have multiple missions. There are a lot of things that we do, but for the most part, they're all to protect the nation. It is to protect life, property, sovereignty. These are all very sort of heady topics. And imagine being the guy at the keyboard in charge, like at risk or in charge of all of that. You're running an operation, and if you make a mistake, you could affect those things for a lot of people. That's a lot of responsibility to take on, and our operators take on that responsibility gladly. But we also, as part of the community, have to make sure that they take care of themselves. So I'll leave you with this. This is meant to be funny. This is one of my favorite responses that we got. I can't tell you, this was how an operator went into an operation, okay? This was before the operation. I am happy to report that it was much lower after the operation. I'll just rest assured. I can't tell you what that number is, but it was lower, trust me. But, you know, I see this response, and this is the person who I'm working for, right? I want to make sure that he has everything he needs in order to do his job the best he can, and that he is happy and healthy and safe. And I think a lot of what we found out from this work is going to help with that, and at least from our perspective. we have certainly started making progress towards that, and we wanted to be here today in order to share these results with the rest of the community.
Okay, let me summarize that bit of data one more time for you. First of all, we found in this survey, in the results that we did, tactical cyber operations increase stress, right? Fatigue, frustration, and cognitive workload. Showed those numbers. Number two, longer operations make people tired, right? Not an enormous surprise, but an important one to provide data to decisions that we make. Number three, Celeste pointed out that fatigue sort of compounds at that 5-hour mark. That tended to be an interesting marker in the findings. And number four, those people pulled through, right? Performance was high no matter what. But the question for all of us, I think, is at what cost? So hopefully you found that bit of information interesting, and you probably are asking yourself, great for the NSA, what does it mean to me? And I'll give you at least 3 ways I think you can apply this in your own environments. Number one, we're going to make the survey public. We're going to put it on nsa.gov, and you can use it in your own environments as a baseline to find out how stressed are your people in a particular task. You can also use it to measure differences as you change your environment. So if you introduce some new policy or you roll out automation of a particular kind, you can give that workforce the survey before and after and see what difference it makes. This is me loving science, right? Let's find out how good these things are. Number two, I would suggest that you review your policies, particularly on task length, how often your managers check in with the workforce, and how physically and mentally they're feeling. And number three, remember the locus of control discussion. It is helpful for people to have some control over their environment. It lowers their stress. It's good for them as humans, and it's also good for you as employers and for the work. So there's lots of ways to collect data. Our survey is one. There are commercial solutions sort of similar to this one that let you sort of capture how people are feeling in the moment as they're doing a particular job. And so lots of different ways that you can do this kind of work. So in addition to the 2-page costs cyber operations stress survey that we'll post, we've done 2 other public papers. If you want more details about the design of the survey or the validation, the second one will appear at Usenic's workshop on Monday, the one on the right, and we hope that you'll download them and check those out as well. So thank you for being interested in this topic and for hearing what we have to say. We would be more than happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Please use the microphones. Thank you.
Yeah, please use the microphones for questions. On the left.
Hi there. First of all, thank you. 2 questions, actually, if that's okay. The first one, weren't you concerned or worried about doing not anonymous form quiz because people know they have like effect, their answers has effect? So
yes, so we took that into consideration. Under normal circumstances, we would try to anonymize data, but for a variety of reasons, we couldn't because we were trying to link other types of data. And we were concerned about that because we didn't want it to go up the chain, so to speak. And so what we did to try to alleviate that was I actually created a little ballot box. So whenever the operators would be done with their operation, they would put the survey in the ballot box. And I had safety stickers on the back of the ballot box so we would know if anyone who wasn't supposed to be in there would be in there. And that maybe helped. Some of the operators, it didn't matter. So we didn't ask them for their names on the surveys, although you could probably guess. But a lot of operators did put their names on the surveys because they wanted to be contacted if we had any questions. So we were concerned about that.
Cool, thank you. And the second one, can you guess or assess how a form of someone like Snowden would look like?
Unfortunately, we can't, but thank you.
Other side?
Yes. Everything here was based on the person's self-assessment of their performance. Now, did you measure or look at their actual performance to see if the two matched up?
Here, here.
That's a tough one that we can't really answer. I'm sorry.
Both are difficult, right? The question is whether we matched up self-reported performance to actual performance. And that's hard to measure, right? Somebody doing a pen test, did they achieve the things you sort of expected them to do? It is something certainly interesting and might help validate the data. We have a lot of confidence in the self-reported data, but lots of people who do human factors research deal with this situation, so it's not unique to us.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, if you're under stress and you're fatigued and tired, how can you properly self-assess your performance?
Well, self-assessment's different than objective measures of performance, and your question was comparing objective performance to self-assessments of performance. And the reason why we measure self-assessment of performance, well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that it doesn't matter if you did well or not. If you think you didn't do well, that's going to affect the amount of stress that you take on. And that's what we were concerned about. I forget what the second one was. It just lost my head. I'm sorry.
Yes.
My question is based on different personality types of the individuals that you were monitoring in your survey, because I'm assuming that you have a lot of what I call 24/7 personalities where they can't turn it off. They're always on, even when they go home and they're thinking about their work and the like. How did you take into account those personality types of like a regular 9-to-5 employee or a 24/7 person, and how that affects them? Because then the stress is constant, even after they left the workplace.
So all of our operators were the same. They took the same kinds of training and did the same types of ops and also ran the same types of schedules. So we couldn't necessarily control if a certain operator was on one schedule versus the other, but we did collect operations openly for whatever session that was going on. And so we captured that in our data. We just didn't analyze it in this presentation.
I'm asking because couldn't that not have a greater effect on a person who seems to care more about an element where they're not able to turn it off than, let's say, a regular 9 to 5?
So we did look at that, and we did not see any effects statistically.
Sorry, one other comment. We were interested in lots of potential variables when we were designing this survey, one of which was sort of an individual thing about how much caffeine did you consume, right? Intuitively, it feels like maybe people who were drinking a lot of coffee might be more stressed or something. What we found was that that wasn't the case, and we dropped that question from the survey. But we had the same sort of thinking as you, which is people are different, and those differences might matter.
Thank you.
All right, so great presentation. Thank you for that. My only question was, did you guys make any recommendations for how to fix the problem?
So the question was whether we made recommendations for how to fix the problem. This was really important data to the NSA to help them understand the decisions that they were making about training, for example, and recruiting and the conduct of the operations. And the details of those are not public, but yes, the results of this work definitely was informative to those decisions. Yes?
So a lot of this looks like results were based on a focus of operators, not so much analysts, where analysts would have that 24 complete burnout related to projects. And operators would sort of, you'd think, be acute stress, maybe not entirely, because they would have many things to work on. Are there any future plans to look at the analysis and analyst side?
So we did think about analysts because they are part of the system. We just didn't study them specifically. I would probably use a different method to study analysts because the type of work that they do is a little bit different than our tactical operators. Even like cyber analysts, I assume that's what you mean?
Yeah,
Or like any type of intelligence analyst.
the one's married to the operators.
Yes, the ones married to the operators. We are concerned about them. We've talked about that. I would use a different method simply because they do different type of work than what the tactical cyber operators are, who are the hands-on keyboard.
We should definitely be concerned about all the kinds of roles in this space, right? Including managers and supervisors and anybody who like has a role in this kind of work. But as Celeste said, I think you'd need a tailored survey that sort of understands their job a little bit better. This one was very tailored to the operation folks.
Thank you.
Over.
Actually, I think this gentleman.
Oh, center, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You have a field there. How long have you worked a job? Did you see any correlations in like differences of answers for how long someone had worked there?
That is the question was whether we saw differences in the length of time for how long somebody had done the job.
The experience.
Right, in terms of their experience. And it wasn't a meaningful result that sort of made this any different. And so, yes, we did capture that, and yes, we have that data. It wasn't an effect on the results you saw here.
Thank you.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. You guys had mentioned, I mean, one of the common themes was that performance pretty much stayed the same.
Sorry, so performance was not correlated to the other factors. So if you remember on this other, just because it might change your question. So performance spanned the scale. It's just that performance didn't have a relationship with any of the other factors, meaning if mental demand happened to be high, there wasn't a relationship with whether or not performance would also be high or low. Does that?
Yeah,
Oh,
but the thing is, you guys made a comment about, failure is not an option, right?
Yes.
And that each participant, followed through no matter what cost. My concern with that is at what cost? I'm a CISO and I have a large organization, and to have that kind of mindset, even though I get it, you're protecting the government, but you have to have a mindset that you have people in place to back you up. Failure can be an option. It's okay to fail. It's okay to make mistakes, things like that. Those types of expectations, even in protecting the government or protecting a Fortune 10 company, will burn you out. And then that would lead to my next question is what's being addressed for the people that have really, for lack of a better term, suffered from, working 10 years as doing ops work and things like that. So what has the NSA provided to them, and what's been the fallout from it?
So for the first part of your question, in terms of NSA policy, failure is not an option, is not a policy. That was not me. And I think this will be the last question because we're out of time. When I say failure is not an option, that is the mindset that the operators are in, not the policy of the agency. They feel the need to succeed because they understand how much is riding on it, even though, things go sideways all the time. Cyber is complex and unpredictable. We know that and we understand that. And, not everything goes as planned. And it's not the operator's fault, which is that control, the lack of control that they're feeling. So I don't really know how to answer that first part because it's not really how we feel about them. We don't feel pressure to succeed above all else. We take that on ourselves as a personal mission.
We'd be happy to talk more at the wrap room if you want.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you have any more questions, we'll be at the wrap room. Thank you.
Thank you.